to my Facebook and probably in my e-blasts. If you
We are
not,
live.
thank you. If you're not on my e-blast list, perhaps someone can put that link in the chat. It will also be on Facebook Live. If you are watching us on Facebook, we are just waiting this last minute before we get started. We are expecting another group of people. It looks like we're about halfway to the number of people who submitted an RSVP. So we will begin very shortly, as soon as my clock hits 6:30. And in case you didn't hear, you can submit questions in the Q&A at any time, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And we are almost at 6:30. Welcome. And thank you to my panelists for being so prompt. We are at 6:30, so I'm going to begin. Rick and Debra, if you want to hide your camera. Oh, actually, you can stay for this part. So good evening, everyone. I see we have a lot of names that are not familiar to me, so I may not know you and you may not know me. I'm State Representative Stephanie Thomas. I represent the 143rd District, which is Norwalk, Wilton, and Westport. I believe in transparency, so I want to say up front that I'm a Democrat by political party. I was a co-sponsor of the resolution to add this question to the ballot about early voting. I also serve as vice chair of the GAE committee in the legislature. But for tonight's purposes, I like to think of myself as an American. And my belief is that voting is one of the most nonpartisan issues that there is. The right to vote and civic engagement, for me, underpins our very democracy. So I'm hosting this event tonight to educate Connecticut voters absent of spin or any partisanship about the very important question that will be on the ballot in the 2022 election. So if you only watch the first 5 minutes of this program, like I tend to do when I'm watching videos, I want to make one thing very clear. Voters in 2022 are only being asked to consider if the General Assembly should be allowed to consider implementing early voting. The ballot question will read, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to permit the General Assembly to provide for early voting? That's it. So I want to make sure this is crystal clear for someone who hasn't been living with this issue like many of us have. A no vote to the ballot question means that no type of early voting will be possible in Connecticut. Not one day, not 1 hour, not 1 minute earlier than 6 a.m. on election day would you be allowed to cast your vote, other than the absentee means we have had in Connecticut prior to COVID. A yes vote means that our lawmakers will debate and consider both what type of early voting makes sense in Connecticut and when it should take effect. And I'll also just say, because I received comments about this last week, town clerks and registrar voters will be able to weigh in on this as part of the regular legislative process. So in my conversations with many different types of people over the last few years, I found out that not everyone is clear about what early voting means, why we need a constitutional amendment, Other people have asked me for a little bit more information about how early voting looks elsewhere or might look in Connecticut. So to cover a little bit of all of those topics, I've invited 3 amazing panelists to discuss these details. Connecticut's very own Secretary of State, Denise Merrill, and we'll talk about how Connecticut is different from some other states where we've been and where we are now in this process. I'm also being joined by Rick McQuaid, who has served as Norwalk's town clerk since 2011. He happens to be a Republican, but he has been cross-endorsed by both the Democrats and Republicans in Norwalk, I think for all of his terms, and he was just not all of them, but the last few. And he was sworn in this morning for his 6th term. And last but not least, Debra Lee, who is the town clerk of Laramie County in Wyoming. Debra also happens to be a Republican. She was elected to her position in 2018, but as some of you heard earlier, she has traveled the world overseeing elections in places such as Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Sudan, just to name a few. In terms of how this evening will run, I'll first speak with Madam Secretary, Denise Merrill, first, and then I'll talk with the 2 clerks, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. You can write your questions in the chat at any time throughout the program, and if you're on Facebook Live, you can write your questions there, and they will be sent to me via the chat. We have just over 100 people logged in already. And just scrolling it, I see we have representatives from the far right, the far left, and everywhere in between. I welcome everybody. Just please know that I treat everyone with respect and expect the same in return for both me and my guests. Rudeness will not be tolerated in the chat or Q&A. If abused, I will ask my staff to eject you from this event. But never fear, you can always dial in later and watch it on Facebook Live. So thank you for your patience with all these opening remarks. And without further ado, let's get to it. Secretary Merrill, thank you for joining us. How are you?
My pleasure. Thank you for doing this. It's great.
Yeah, no problem. I feel like this is something you've been living with quite a while. So I'm going to jump right in and ask you to take us back and explain to us, and those of us who don't, especially those who don't know, why are we even having this conversation about early voting in Connecticut, and what's the link to the Constitution? Like, why do we have to have a constitutional amendment?
Right. Well, in order to answer that question, I'm afraid I have to do a little bit of a history lesson. So bear with me, because Connecticut is indeed an outlier in all of this. And people from other states are always kind of amazed at our system. First of all, Connecticut's one of only 6 states, along with Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, that does not allow voters to cast ballots before Election Day without an excuse. In Connecticut, the prohibitions about early voting are enshrined in the state constitution. That is extremely unique. I don't think there are any states left that still have that. Several of them had it and removed it, almost unanimously, by the way, in both Vermont and New York, among others. It seems to have, it just makes reform really, really difficult, because in order to change the state constitution, you have to have a vote of a General Assembly, and they have to vote by 3/4 in order to get it on the ballot. Then all the citizens of the state can vote on that ballot question. So this is the opportunity for everyone to weigh in. If that ballot issue passes on the ballot, then the General Assembly in the following couple of sessions would implement whatever the rules would be about however we chose to do this or whatever else was on the ballot. So as a little history, interestingly, the section was added to the Constitution as a pro-democracy reform. Prior to the Civil War, there was no way for voters to cast their ballots aside from in person on election day. The Connecticut legislature passed a constitutional amendment to allow soldiers to vote in the Civil War, but it was unsettled. It was undone at the end of the war. So it started as a way to allow soldiers to be able to vote from the field. Then they passed a statute, probably unconstitutionally, allowing soldiers to vote in World War I, similar to what they had done for the Civil War. The right to vote by absentee ballot was included in the 1932 Connecticut Constitution, but that clause precluded early voting. So it was just to allow people to vote by absentee ballot, basically. So it was, the whole thing was really designed in the 19th and 20th centuries for those situations. Early voting would remove the hurdles. So it's been a topic for a long time in Connecticut, mostly because we are such outliers. Almost every other state has allowed some form of early voting. We also have a key difference, and you're going to hear that probably from Debra Lee, about we don't have a county system in Connecticut. So our election system is extremely local. 169 towns. Every town has a Republican and a Democratic registrar of voters who is responsible for registering voters and then hiring the poll workers and the functioning of election day. And they do it jointly all year long. And you can imagine that in some small towns, it's a very part-time job. And in big cities, there will be a two full-time registrars plus 2 or 3, assistants. So the job varies dramatically. And then you have the responsibility for absentee ballots somewhere along the way got divided away from the registrars and went to the town clerks. I suspect because town clerks are most often at town hall. Registrars are usually a much more part-time job. So for reasons that I don't really remember, I think it happened maybe within the last 30 years, that job was carved off. And so now clerks are the ones that manage absentee ballots. So I think we're very unique. In most states, there's a county clerk who manages all the election process. And there is no such thing as registrars of voters. So you can see it's a little confusing for voters, I think, to know why are we doing this? How does this all work? And it is the fact that these provisions are in our state constitution that make it so difficult to change.
Yeah, I remember when I first learned that and I thought, wow, that's, because I was very curious why other states seem to change so many things so often.
Right.
But Connecticut was, living with something that's been in existence for a long time. I have 2 follow-up questions for you. The first, so there was a question on the ballot in 2014. And it always stands out in my mind because I used to, like many people who move, I used to go to my old polling place and vote, but the 2014 election happened to be one of my first where I voted in my new home here in Norwalk. And I remember seeing that ballot question and I had no idea what it meant. Later, after I was elected, I went back and listened to all the testimony from when that ballot question originated. And there were some people who said during the public hearing or the committee meeting, like, we don't think this is clear, but they were basically voted down. So can you talk a little bit about what did happen in 2014? How did that ballot question fare? Do you think there was an issue with the language, and what changed in 2019, which is the question we're living with now in 2022?
Yeah, sure. I think a number of things have changed. Perhaps at that time, it wasn't really clear to people. It wasn't as big an issue as it is now. honestly, I think COVID changed a lot because we gave people the opportunity during the COVID crisis to vote by absentee ballot in case they just couldn't get to the polls because they feared COVID, basically. Mm-hmm. And that opened a lot of people's eyes to this opportunity that made it a lot easier for them to vote. And frankly, the public loves it because it's easier for them to vote. But that was not true in 2014. In 2014, many advocates had been advocating for more opportunities to vote. And by that time, most other states had already passed these statutes because they could. And so when we put this on the ballot in 2014, and that was part of an effort from my office as well as others, we put it on to give it the most flexibility, I guess. And then somehow the lawyers in the General Assembly came up with the language. And I pulled it up here just to show you what it said. It said, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to remove restrictions concerning absentee ballots and to permit a person to vote without appearing at a polling place on the day of an election? So I had a number of people say to me, oh, I voted against that terrible measure that was going to take away my right to vote. You see how confused people were about it. And there was also,
I think I voted against it because I thought that sounds very dangerous with the
sounds very sketchy, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that happened. And also, even then, there was kind of an anti-government sentiment at the time. I think we had a big budget deficit or something. And, people were like, the General Assembly, we're not going to let them decide this. Well, forgetting the fact that the General Assembly is the one that passes all laws. But, I think there was some of that too.
To this point, I'm actually going to insert a question that was emailed to us. Some people sent questions in advance. And it was, does the state of Connecticut have a budget to educate voters about ballot referendums? So to that point, I don't remember even knowing something would be on the ballot when I got to the polls. So can you talk about that?
That was an enormous problem. And I have asked over and over again for money for public information for the public about all elections, about how you can do an absentee ballot, about how you vote at the polling places. Until COVID, where we had some money from the federal government to do some public service announcements, we really have no budget for that whatsoever. And so I think it kind of failed for lack of interest in 2014. There was not a big effort mounted to get it passed. And I certainly had no budget to do any of that. So that was part of the problem. Yeah.
Fair enough. And you touched upon it earlier. Can you just explain, because I do think it gets into the weeds a little bit, the difference between, with regard to the voting process, what the secretary's office does, what the town clerks do, and what the registrars do? That's a long, like the 1 minute version.
I am so glad you asked that question because every time, most of the times things go extremely well in Connecticut. I have to say, we have a very robust election system here, mostly because it is so local. My office does nothing in terms of maintaining the lists, hiring people for election day, overseeing any part of that process, mailing anything out. We do nothing. It is all done at the local level in both the municipal election and in the statewide elections. So I know people frequently will criticize us about this and that and say, that secretary, she's, not keeping those lists up properly or whatever. Actually, you're not criticizing me. You're criticizing the town clerks and town registrars, and they are very hardworking. And I would say 90% or more of them are there, certainly not for the salary, because it's not very high in most places, but for the love of elections. They really believe in elections and voting as being one of our most important parts of democracy. And they're usually public servants at the local level who have been put there by their party. They are party representatives in a way because they're nominated by the respective parties. But that always, it kind of peeves me because, you know, criticizing them is just not tenable to me. I see so much hard work that goes into this, and really mostly for the love of it.
No, absolutely. So I'm going to end our discussion here, so I make sure I keep time for the town clerks and for the Q&A. You're welcome to hide your camera if you like, and then we'll pull you back in for the Q&A. But as always, thank you. I'm always amazed that some of this stuff goes back to the Civil War. Okay, Debra, Rick, welcome, welcome. Thank you both for taking time. I actually want to start with something that Secretary Merrill just said, and it's about sort of the spirit of town clerks. The registrars I've met, the town clerks I've met, they seem to all be similar, that they hold themselves to a very high standard, take their role in protecting elections and integrity very seriously. So I just thought it'd be nice if you just gave me a sense of, or gave all of us a sense of what the town clerk community, like who are the town clerks? Rick, I'll start with you.
We're an interesting breed, I guess, as someone would say at times. Here in Norwalk, I think I'm very fortunate. I came into the job where there were established registrar of voters. Stuart Wells and Karen Lyons were both here, and I was fortunate to have them as mentors and people to work with. And I believe we have an excellent group that run elections in Norwalk. We have a lot of other different things. People don't realize that, you know, in the case of registrar of voters, they handle more of just elections and voter registrations and things. In a town clerk's office, we have just so many things. We have vital records, birth, marriages, and deaths, land recordings. You know, Norwalk being a hospital town, we have surrounding towns that use our hospital and facilities. So a lot of our vital records and everything are from not only Norwalk residents, but residents in vicinities around us. You know, we handle dog licensing and fishing license. So we add the absentee ballot part of the election to our group of things that we do. And we're lucky that we have register of voters that we can work with and bounce things off, and they also help us with it. So it's a lot more for just the town clerk elections than it is for maybe just the registrars, of which that's their specialty.
Thank you. And Debra, anything to add about the town clerk community? And you're muted. Uh-oh, it was working perfectly before, but we can't hear you.
Hold on.
Oh,
Okay.
there you
go. Good. Thank you. Well, I can only speak about county clerks in Wyoming.
That's
and
true.
I would say, I echo a lot of what Rick said. We are highly detailed, passionate, and care deeply about public service and upholding the law. And if there are to be any changes to the law, we want to have the opportunity to weigh in on it because we are closest to the voters. I would say the most effective county clerks, while they may run for office as partisan candidates, they are non-political. Politics doesn't play a part in our work. Service is above politics for us. And generally, they do have prior experience in the office, or I would say subject matter expertise in at least one of the areas that our office has responsibility, which is election administration, motor vehicle titles, real estate recording, or finance.
Thank you. I want to talk about, for lack of a better term, voter fraud. It's something I feel like you can't open a paper or listen to the news without hearing something about this topic. And you both have had long careers in this space. And you, Debra, have had early voting in Wyoming for quite some time now. Can you, whether you have stats or just anecdotally, can you give me a sense of how prevalent malfeasance is, either with early voting or in your case, Rick, just election day voting? And I'll start with you, Debra.
I haven't heard of any cases that have been prosecuted for early voting fraud. Although we do have a couple that are under investigation now. These are it appears cases where people voted early here in Laramie County and then went on election day to another county. And that was detected by the Secretary of State's office. So I can't see, I don't know how that will shake out. But voter fraud in general in Wyoming is not prevalent at all. In fact, we've only had 3 voter fraud prosecutions since 2000. And that was for election day.
And I know I have heard some people say, I don't happen to share this, but I've heard the impression that, you know, no fraud is acceptable. I just don't happen to think that's a threshold that could ever be met for any system. One person, somewhere, one year will always try to cheat any system that exists. So given the prevalence or lack thereof in Wyoming, because you, like you said, you have a couple of cases this year, I don't know if that's fraud or if people made mistakes. Do you feel that it should, you know, would you ever think about repealing something like early voting because of that?
No, not at all. Those of us who administer elections know there's no such thing as a perfect election. These are human endeavors. And if you think about it, they are extremely complex logistical exercises with many moving parts. Yeah, early voting, I think, is really essential to voter participation, especially in this current era.
And I'm going to get back to you, Debra, in 1 minute to pick up on that. But Rick, any thoughts about what you've seen here in Norwalk?
You know, I have to agree with Debra. It's not something that we see. We hear about it a lot. You know, in the 2020 election, you know, every day there was someone coming in and saying, you know, what type of fraud is going on today, or different things along those lines. And you know, I don't think anyone in a town clerk's office or registrar's office or anyone that's involved with any type of election enforcement or elections that are going on gets up in the morning and says, today's the day we're going to go do fraud. I just think that it's an excuse or some kind of a blanket to put over something that takes away from the actual process of what we're doing. You know, our job is to give people the way to go vote, to more, you know, give them any opportunity they can to vote. I don't believe that early voting or absentee voting is causing fraud. I just don't see it. And it's just something we hear, but we don't see in Norwalk. And I have to ask Madam Secretary, I don't think they really hear much of it either.
No, thank you for that. And picking up on what you said a few minutes ago, Debra, since you have had early voting for quite some time, and there is a question along these lines in the chat, can you give us a sense of who is using it? Has it increased your numbers, decreased? Are your numbers flat? If you have any data or anecdotal thoughts to share.
Well, early voting is increasingly becoming popular. It's a choice, an option for voters who want to cast a ballot in person, but either they choose not to or they're unable to go to the polls on election day. We do have a number of government employees and downtown business people who take advantage of the opportunity to vote early because we're in the capital city. We also see a number of senior citizens who avail themselves of the opportunity to vote early. In Wyoming, we have a number of snowbirds. These are people who leave Wyoming in the winter, and they like to come in and be able to vote in person before they leave the state. And also, we have a number of persons with disabilities who take advantage of the opportunity to vote early, because generally it's not as crowded as a polling place might be on election day. We also have people who are in the county building, which is where we have early voting. They're here to conduct a business. They're here to title or register their vehicles, record documents, pay property taxes, do business with the courts. And while they're here, they vote. So we do see those kinds of people who vote early. Statistic-wise, from 2010 to our recent tax election, which was last week, the percentage of those voting early has gone from 12% in 2010 to 32% in 2021. To give you an idea of numbers, that's 14,000 early voters. It's not uncommon during a presidential election to see lines winding around the county building with wait times of an hour or more, something generally not seen in Wyoming, I'll add, to vote early. In 2020's general election, the combination of COVID-19 and the major presidential election made absentee mail ballot and early voting very popular. In fact, 59% of our voters cast their ballots before November 3rd in 2020. And that was pretty close. 31% voted early and 28% voted by absentee mail ballot. I only see early voting increasing in the years to come.
And how about locally, Rick? Obviously, we don't have early voting, but
Right.
because of COVID-19 here in Connecticut, for the last two general election, or the municipal elections and the general election in 2020, we were basically able to have a no excuse absentee
Right.
ballot. How did that affect both the numbers locally, but also how did it work in your office?
Well, I think the 2020 election was an eye-opener to many of us in the state. We did close to 18,000 absentee ballots in 2020 with an excellent return to of almost 17,000. So we did see an increase of it, but I think, there was COVID involved in that. It was a much larger election. But we did notice a trend this year in our municipal election last week that we had gone from an average of about 500 absentee ballots a year where we were up over 1,400, which is, almost 2 times more what we were doing. And I think what was happening to it was a lot of college students, a lot more people were involved because of the 2020 election. They carried over into the municipal election, and a lot of senior citizens just not wanting to be in the group, atmosphere at voting and things. I don't think it affected our traffic at the polls, other than our numbers were down like they are in municipal elections. But I do believe that, we were still able to make both sides work.
That's great. And speaking of the process, even though the ballot question in 2022 won't tackle what early voting is or would look like in Connecticut, I think it's helpful if people understand there are basically as many models out there as there are states. Everyone has something slightly different. So Debra, I would love it if you could take a few minutes and walk us through what your system is like, just to give us a sense. And then Rick, fair warning, I'm gonna kick it to you to say, if you could create any system here in Connecticut, what would it look like? But I won't hold you to it.
Please, no.
But we'll splice out that part.
Yes, please.
But, blue sky, blue sky.
I just got reappointed today, please.
Yeah, that cross endorsement's gone now. Debra, if you could just walk us through your system.
Absolutely. So Wyoming is, I would say, an outlier in that we allow early voting 45 days prior to the election, which is a very long time. And early voting ends the day before the election. Weekends and holidays are excluded, so that equates to about 32 voting days. And under Wyoming law, establishment of an early voting site is at the discretion of the county commissioners. So it's not uniformly done across the state, although it is becoming more and more popular. So this lack of uniformity can be confusing for voters as well as for campaigns because they don't know where to put their energy. Early voting by state law has to be done in the courthouse or other public building. This year, the state legislature, however, did pass a law which allows for county clerks to establish satellite early voting at other locations. And this could accommodate, let's say, a one-day Saturday voting event in a small community. And we're very happy to have that option to be able to get out to our smaller areas. We do use the state's voter registration system during early voting to register and check in voters. This ensures that the HAVA eligibility checks are performed and information is immediately entered into the state's voter registration database. This is something our electronic poll books used on election day do not do. So this helps strengthen the integrity of this process. Use of the system also allows us to see if a voter has been issued and returned an absentee ballot. So voters who have been sent an absentee ballot but have not yet voted that ballot do have the option. They can surrender it if they have it with them, or we will cancel it in the system, and then they vote in person. So that way no one is voting twice. Those voting early are also required by law to sign an affidavit affirming that they know they're voting early and that they will not vote again on election day. And we keep all those affidavits on file as part of our election records. We record the number of registrations and check-ins and ballots cast on a daily basis throughout that 45-day period, and equipment is secured and sealed at the end of each day. So there's a lot of checks and balances and accountability with the system.
That's, it reminds me of all the work the town clerks or county clerks do to make sure this all works and works with very few hiccups. Rick, now's your blue sky moment.
My blue sky moment is I'm moving to Wyoming. I'll just follow what Debra has to offer. No, really, I think what we need to remember today is that the question is getting it to the table. With 169 different cities and towns in Connecticut, we're all going to have different ways of doing this if that's the way we're going to go forward. I like the idea of, I don't like the 45 days. I think that's too long a period. You know, under 30 days. I like the no weekend, no holiday effect to it too. But I also have to say that with town clerks, with all of us being so involved in other things, we're going to have to set up almost like a division of elections in a town clerk's office or registrar of voters office. So we've got a lot of baby steps to take forward first. I believe that early voting is something that we definitely should take a look at. I know others may not agree with me, but I think we need to offer as much of an opportunity to everyone to vote, and that everyone has some input into how we're going to go about it. So I don't see it. I see the question being presented in 2022, but I don't see 2023 being that's the day we're going to start it. I think we need to go a lot of people involved, including all the cities and towns, because some towns are smaller, and Norwalk being a larger city, there's a lot of different aspects that we need to look at from our own individual offices to move forward.
I think that's right. I was going to ask this Madam Secretary if she wanted to weigh in. I will when she comes back. But, you know, I think you hit on a key point, which is we do have this system of 169 different towns. The town clerks have to be at the table for any discussions around how this looks in Connecticut. But I was going to ask you, Madam Secretary, since we're blue skying, do you have any vision you would have for Connecticut of what it would look like if early voting were able to be implemented in Connecticut?
Well, I definitely think we ought to have some days besides election day for people to be able to come in and vote. And as you say, there's 50 different models to look at out there. I like Wyoming's system. It sounds very, it's in a way, it's good to have that many days because that will spread out the work over a number of days as well. And it sounds like their system of using the statewide voter registration system is very similar to what we do now. And it is a good statewide system because then you can check to see if someone's still registered someone else, you know, so you can have a pretty, we are known for having quite an accurate list in Connecticut. We do better every year, I think. But that being said, I would defer honestly to local people because they are the ones that do this. And as Rick says, the problem is there are 169 towns. 50% of them have only one polling place. They are that small. And so that's going to look very different than a town that has 25 polling places. So those differences will have to be accommodated in some way, as we have in our statutes now for many other things. But I think the answer is I would defer to local people. I think we need to bring in some new technology. Many states use, for example, it's actually Pitney Bowes Equipment, which is a company right here in Connecticut that will open ballot, open the envelope, count them. I mean, do all these things within minutes. And so that sort of technology we might have to bring in, maybe on a regional or even statewide basis to help out with just the processing of all the paper if you're going to go in the way of absentee voting. But for early voting, you know, I would remind people, first of all, the issue on the ballot just allows the General Assembly to do something if they choose to. They may choose not to do anything. I mean, that's a possibility. It opens the door to the possibility. And I think, you know, I just hope everyone remembers that we are all about the voters here. This is really not just about convenience, but about making sure that everybody has a chance to vote. And at bottom, that's really what we're talking about here. So I think there's many ways we can get to where we want to go. I've seen states, for example, Florida, just as another example, they have, I think, 10 or 12 days of early voting, but they don't open every polling place. They only open polling places in town halls or libraries and buildings that are already open. Because I know some people have expressed concern, oh, it's going to cost so much money to have all these polling places open. Well, not necessarily. And so that's what we have to work out. I think people in Connecticut, as we've been saying, got an eyeful during the last couple of election cycles because they now see the possibility and they see it on television. They see other states, you know, like Texas, I think they vote for something like 30 days of early voting. And they're like, well, they're all voting already. Why can't we do that? I think you just have to remember that it really is about the voter that we're trying to make these accommodations.
No, 100%. And I can't underscore enough that there are so many different models out. So even, you know, you talked about technology and I thought you were going to say something else because in Wyoming, I know you have kiosks. Is that right, Debra? Or
do you mean kiosk voting machines?
Yeah.
Or we do in Laramie County. We do in Laramie County. Ballot marking devices.
Which is interesting and something I don't even think we've ever talked about in Connecticut. But I just say that to underscore how all these systems are different. And, you know, I think the devil is in the details and figuring out what makes sense for the towns of Connecticut. I'm trying to read all the questions in the chat, but a couple were sent to me in advance, and I see it here a couple of times. Some people who were interested in making sure that people in Connecticut are educated about this issue. And they ask, and maybe this is a question for you, Madam Secretary, what can they do to help spread the word or get the word out there, especially since we heard there's no budget for this?
Well, you can start with calling your state representatives and senators and asking them to put some money in the budget to do this. We wouldn't need that much, but we could do an effort with a couple $100,000, for example. It would be harder in the TV market because, as most of us know, media in the Fairfield County market in particular is very, very expensive to do TV ads, but we could certainly do an online set of, you know, social media kind of ads and that sort of thing. It's hard to reach people in Connecticut because they listen to many different media sources, but certainly it would help. So that would be very helpful. I hope the advocacy groups step forward and mount an effort. I know there are numbers of groups that are working on this, but you do need some funding to do it. I have asked the governor's office to put some money in my budget to do a public information campaign, as we did for the COVID absentee balloting. So far they have not put it in, but I don't know. You know, I think it should be in there, absolutely, to educate voters about what this is all about. So at least they will have the choice and they'll understand that choice.
Thank you. There's a question about no excuse absentee ballots. And maybe I'll take a stab at answering that as quickly as possible. To have no excuse absentee voting in Connecticut will also require a constitutional amendment separate from the early voting constitutional amendment. As Denise said earlier, to have it added to the ballot would require a 2/3 majority vote in both the House and the Senate in order to appear on the ballot. It was proposed in this session, 2021. It did pass, but only by a simple majority, not a 2/3 majority. So the exact same ballot question has to be considered again in the next session. And if it passes again by a simple majority, then it can be added to the ballot the following year. Hopefully that made sense. I don't want to spend too much time on it since it's a little outside of our issue. There are some questions about you know, if the federal voting act is passed, how that will come into play. I think that's a little too far afield for tonight. My sort of thought about all of this is we in Connecticut, until that's passed, let's do what we're doing in Connecticut. And if it's passed, we'll deal with that at that time. There's a question, would early voting adversely affect both Democratic and Republican registrars in all the towns? Would it create chaos? So I think what we've heard is that would fall within the responsibility of the town clerk, not the registrar. And I don't think, Rick or Debra, you've seen any differences in terms of issues by party, Republican or Democrat. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yes, we've not seen any differences.
We have not.
Thank you. Sorry, there's a lot of questions here. Someone was asking, did the state send out absentee ballot applications in 2020? Just to make it clear for everyone. In fact, Madam Secretary, you probably have it top of mind, whereas I'd have to go back to my notes. Can you walk us through the only way someone is allowed to vote by absentee ballot under our current law, which most people don't realize, and I know this from door knocking the last 2 years, most people don't realize what they were able to do during COVID is not allowable normally.
Right.
Because many people just never tried, but they always thought they had the right to. They didn't know they'd be breaking the law. So can you tell us, I forget the 5 provisions? Yeah.
Yes, I can. I'm not sure I can recite them all by heart, but yes, you're correct. In Connecticut, we don't have a strong history of absentee balloting. Usually in most elections statewide, about 4% of our electorate vote by absentee ballot. And I think you're right, it's sort of a culture of voting in person. I don't think people even realize it's available in many cases. COVID changed all that because just for the 2020 election, and then it was extended by the General Assembly into 2021, people were able to vote by absentee ballot without what we call an excuse. And the excuses in Connecticut are again enshrined in our state constitution, which is highly unusual for any constitution to be sort of like a cookbook on a certain set of laws. And what it says is, you are only able to get an absentee ballot in Connecticut if the 2 big ones are you're absent from the polling place on election day, or you think you're going to be. I think it actually says you may be absent from the polling place because sometimes people don't know one way or the other, or if you're unable to get to the polling place due to sickness. And then there are a couple of others that are rarely used, one of them involving a kind of a religious exemption if your religion does not allow you to go to the polling place or something like that, and a couple of others that are rarely invoked. And so it's very narrow, but because no one has asked much about it, many of the, all these years, no one realized that we really don't have any way to check to make sure that you're actually out of town. For example, if you come in and you request an absentee ballot and you check the box that says, I'm going to be out of town on election day, we don't really have the election police to go find out if you're actually out of town. The only time that seems to come up is when candidates are trying to get something on their opponent and they say, you know, my opponent's wife said she was going to be out of town, but I saw her at the grocery store, and that sort of thing. So it's kind of an odd provision in the sense that there's very, very little enforcement power. But like I say, it's never been a big problem in Connecticut because most people don't ask for absentee ballots. And in Connecticut, it's difficult to get an absentee ballot. Most states also do not require you to apply for an absentee ballot. In fact, some states just mail ballots to everyone who's on the list. We have a very extensive process for applying for a ballot. You have to get the application, download it, mail it in. The clerk checks to make sure you're on the list. You have to swear under penalty of perjury that you are the person on that list. Then they mail it back to you. Then you fill out the ballot. There's 2 or 3 envelopes involved. You have to not sign your ballot to make sure it's anonymous. So all I'm saying is, without going through the whole thing, a lot of checks and balances. But again, that's never been an issue because we haven't had many people request them. And I would be the first to say that if we were to change the law to allow more absentee balloting, we would definitely have to look at that process, because it would be an enormous increase in work for the clerks to process, let's say, the 35% that they processed during 2020. And they were able to do it miraculously almost. And because we had a large amount of federal funding that we were able to give to the towns so they could hire extra help. And even then it was a Herculean task because not all towns have space for more helpers. You have to train them all. I mean, it's not an easy job. So all of that, of course, would have to be considered if we were going to go in that direction. But that's not what we're here about tonight. Early voting is something very different than the no-fault absentee ballots. And I know people get them mixed up. I would just be curious if I can ask a question of Debra. do you mail applications for absentee ballots in Wyoming, or how does that work in your state?
No, we do not mail absentee ballot applications. However, in 2020, the Secretary of State did inform voters of the opportunity to submit an application, and they did provide an application. That was the exception in 2020.
Yeah, that's very similar to what almost all the states did as an accommodation. So many people, we have to put ourselves back there. There was no vaccine at the time. And particularly senior citizens were terrified. And I got hundreds of emails from people saying, oh my gosh, how am I going to exercise my right to vote? Because, that generation is very keen on voting and they are determined to have that right. And they were horrified to think that they wouldn't be able to vote. And so it was really quite wrenching as a decision, I think, especially where we had to work within that constitutional framework. So it's just, we have to remember what was going on, but it also opened people's eyes to the opportunities for early voting and no-fault absentee balloting. And I think that's why we're talking about it today.
No, absolutely. And I will just underscore, because I've lived it myself and I've heard it a lot in my part of the state. We have a lot of commuters who go to New York City. And I can tell you that 5:23 a.m. train used to be packed. And, I remember I had a bunch of meetings and I said, oh, maybe I'll do an absentee ballot. It seemed simple enough because I was always working long hours. And I was too nervous to fill it out because it would have been a lie, because the chances are I might have made it back before 8 p.m. But you know how it is at a work day. You don't know for sure until, a meeting runs late. So I never did absentee. And I've heard many people say that, they did not want to break the law. So sometimes they miss voting because they didn't want to assert in advance that they definitely, and people don't realize how narrow the definition is. You can't be in the polling city town within any of the open hours of voting. So it's not enough to say oh, my workday was really busy till 6 p.m., but I made it home by 7. You still can't vote absentee technically. So anyway.
Well, I'll just add a little factoid here, and it's a little in the weeds, but basically that definition was added by statute. The Constitution does not say all hours of the polling day. It just says you have to be absent from the jurisdiction on election day. And at some point, I think in the 1980s, they added this clarification that it meant you had to be gone all hours of the polling day. And I think that's just made it in a way worse, because now people are really concerned. Is it going to be every hour? Is it going to be only half the day? So all these are complications that I think we just need to remove.
So far, my takeaway is that the legislature needs to look at that and give a budget. And Rick, you look like you wanted to say something.
No, I was listening to the, just the stories that come into us from people as far as absentee ballots. It's something that needs to be tightened up a little bit. There is no absentee ballot police. As much as people call us all the time and they'll say, I saw so-and-so in town. We have so many things to do on election day. I don't even know who's in town other than, what needs to be done and things along those lines. We had an interesting one, and I just give a quick story to share, is somebody wanted to vote said they had power of attorney for their daughter who was away at college, and had their attorney call us and say, she has power of attorney of her daughter and she should be allowed to vote. Well, that didn't go very well, because I called Heather at the state office and basically it was, that's not going to happen. And you can understand why. That would be something that would send a flare up as fraud. I mean, because you would never be able to follow it out. So just listening back and forth about the absentee ballot stories are interesting. So it's all in the day's work, as we say.
Definitely. Oh my gosh, time flies. We have a question asking about, so if this ballot referendum passes in the 2022 elections, clarifying whether or not the General Assembly has a certain time frame within which to act, will there be budgetary considerations, etc.? I was going to answer that, but Madam Secretary, please.
Go ahead, go right ahead.
No, I was going to say there's no time frame. I think we touched upon this earlier, and I think people would probably be frustrated to find out what the time frame will be, just in the natural course of getting bills through committee and having discussion and having something passed. As we said earlier, I don't know anyone in the legislature who thinks that, you know, we have something ready packaged that's ready to go. Like I said, we would definitely want registrars, town clerks at the table, look at what other states are doing, learn from them. Yeah, so it's going to be a process in and of itself. But there was also a question saying, why do we need early voting if we have absentee voting? And we just finished a conversation about that. So hopefully that was answered for you. But I do think we need to move forward with this early voting. Oh, wait, I'm back with my hat on. Yes, my neutrality is now gone. I, Stephanie Thomas, believe we need to move forward with early voting because I do think the genie is out of the bottle a little bit after COVID. And I can tell you now, if I had to anecdotally say, at least 4 out of every 10 people have no idea that they cannot and will not be able to vote this way moving forward, vote before election day. And I can't tell you how many people I spoke with from, you know, people caring for elderly parents who live with them, and it was just so much better for them and their lifestyle to make sure that their vote counted, their child's vote counted, their elderly parents' vote counted. I could go on and on because I believe in this greatly. There was a question I thought was interesting, a few questions. At the top of the program, I had mentioned that Rick McQuaid is a Republican by party, but cross-endorsed by Democrats and Republicans in Norwalk, and that Debra Lee is a Republican as well. And they were asking about the others, the 2 of us. I am a Democrat. Denise, Merrill, I believe you identify as a Democrat as well. Yes. Yes. I happen not to think this is relevant for this issue, but it did come up several times, so I wanted to answer it. We are over time. I want to thank my panelists, but I feel like I've rushed you. If you, all of you, last 10 seconds, final thoughts, Madam Secretary.
Oh boy, just thank you, Representative Thomas, for putting this together tonight. I think all we can do to give the public information about this, it's complicated in Connecticut, difficult to understand. And I just hope we can get an effort to at least let the public know what actually this ballot question means. I think this forum is a great way to do that. And I hope we can do more of them throughout the state. So thank you very much. And I'm fascinated by Wyoming and what you're doing there. So thank you very much for being with us. I always learn something new every time I talk to somebody from another state. And Rick, nice to see you too. So thanks very much again for all of you coming together tonight.
Thank you for your time. I know it's very precious. Final words, Rick McQuaid.
You know, I think it's important that we get the word out that this gets it to the table. If we vote in favor of it, it gets it to the table where we can all start figuring out what is the next step for all the towns and cities in the state. So I appreciate you doing this webinar for all of us. Madam Secretary, I wish you the best. I hear that this may be your last term, and thank you for all your guidance that you've given us over the years. And Debra Lee, Wyoming sounds like a good place. And we may end up there visiting someday. And Stephanie, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and congratulations again on your swearing in for your 6th term. And Debra Lee, final words.
Well, we would welcome you to Wyoming, and I would just underscore that our voters find it a great convenience, especially because they get to vote in person, and that's very important to them.
That's a good point, and thank you for bringing that up. We didn't talk about that earlier. Thank you all for your time. Thank you everyone for watching. This will live on my Facebook page, and I'll try to send it out to people as well. Have a great evening, and thank you so much to my incredible team who made this all happen and work as flawlessly as I promised at the beginning. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.